Okay, so I think we're going to get going here. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. This is our first webinar of the fall webinar series, The Birds of Newfoundland Part 2, a deep dive. And I see some familiar names here. So I know that some of you were able to make it out to our spring webinar series, The Birds of Newfoundland Part 1, which was an identification-based series. This one is going to be a little bit more research focused. But if you're interested in checking out some of the videos from the other webinar series, you can find them on the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas website. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Catherine Dale. I'm coordinator of the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas, and I work for Birds Canada, which is a nationwide charitable organization whose mission is to advance the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds and their habitats in Canada. And one of the main ways we do this, as many of you know, is by running many different citizen science programs across the country. So that's programs that rely on volunteers, people like you, carrying out bird surveys and submitting their observations to our Nature Counts database. And there's no way that we could do the work that we do without the more than 70,000 volunteers who donate their time and energy to our programs every year. Here in Newfoundland, we're a relatively recent arrival. But we have two programs. So the first is the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And basically this is a 5-year effort to map out the abundance and the distribution of all of the bird species that breed on the island of Newfoundland. And many of you are familiar with this project. For those of you who aren't, we've just finished year 3 of 5, so there's still lots of time to get involved. And our second program here in Newfoundland is the Nocturnal Owl Survey. And this is a spring survey. It takes place between the 1st of April and the 15th of May every year. And it involves citizen scientists going out at night and listening for owls along a set route, just one evening, reporting back to us about what they've heard. It's a lot of fun. And both of these programs are always looking for volunteers. So if you're interested, you can check out the Atlas website, nf.birdatlas.ca, or you can email me at cdale@birdscanada.org. And I'll put that in the chat. Before we hand it over to our speaker, I'd like to thank all of the partners and funders of the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas, because without their support, we wouldn't be able to offer awesome workshops like these. And thank you for coming out tonight. And finally, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. So I'm really excited to welcome the Director of Birds Canada's Atlantic Office, Dr. Laura Tranquilla, who also happens to be my boss. No pressure on the introduction here. Laura is currently based in Sackville, New Brunswick, but she's a seabird biologist and she did her PhD at Memorial University in St. John's. So she's very familiar with Newfoundland. As part of her role at Birds Canada, she's taken a strong interest in one seabird in particular, the Leach's Storm-Petrel, and she's made Birds Canada a hub for a lot of the Storm-Petrel research happening in the Atlantic provinces. So today she's going to tell us all about the exciting things that are happening across the region about this little bird. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and let Laura start sharing.
Thank you, Catherine. Very pleased to be here this evening. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up if you can. So thanks so much. I'm going to give a presentation, as you know, about Leach's Storm-Petrels, and I'm not able to monitor the chat for questions while I'm in the middle of talking, but feel free to stop me and ask questions if you want, or you can save your questions and there'll be time for them at the end. Okay. So just briefly, I'm going to tell you about what is a Leach's Storm-Petrel tonight, review a little bit about the population status and threats of this bird, and then tell you about the collaborative monitoring and research that's happening in the Atlantic region. And before I go any further, I want to say that almost everything I'm going to talk about tonight represents work and collaborative effort by the Atlantic Leach's Storm-Petrel Working Group. So it's certainly not just me, and it's certainly not just Birds Canada. It's a whole host of people, including folks at Environment and Climate Change Canada, multiple universities in the region, including Acadia, UNB, Dalhousie, Memorial, Queen's, and Bowdoin College, and Birds Canada. So it's a real group effort that I'm going to be talking about tonight. So let's get into the Leach's Storm-Petrel topic. So these are very small birds. I'm sure many of you in Newfoundland have encountered them at one point or other. They're about 45 grams. For reference, that's about the weight of 2 AA batteries. They're not large birds. They're a highly pelagic species, and by that I mean they are spending their time, most of their time, out at sea on the high seas for most of their life. They're members of the tube-nose family. In science, we call that Procelariform, but tube-nose family members have 3 really interesting characteristics. Number 1 is the tube nose. So they have almost like what looks like a straw on the top of their beak, and that gives them their name, the tube nose. So other members of this family include albatrosses and shearwaters, in addition to these petrels. Another interesting fact about tube nose is they're very, very long lived. They're among the longest lived seabirds that we have. And they also, like I said, are very pelagic. So the 3 characteristics of the tube nose is the tube, the pelagic behaviors, and the long-lived nature of these birds. Leach's Storm-Petrel breed in colonies in the North Atlantic and the North Pacific, and they winter all the way to the tropics. They are, as I said, they're quite long-lived. The oldest known Leach's Storm-Petrel that we know is still nesting at a colony is 38 years old. They're burrow nesters, which means they go to the forest at offshore islands and dig a small burrow with their feet. And they attend these burrows at colonies only under cover of darkness. So only at the night will they return to these colonies. They're very nocturnal. They find their burrows amidst a network of all kinds of other burrows at the colony, using their sense of smell and calling to the other birds that are at the colony. They lay a single egg every year, just one egg, which hopefully hatches into a chick. Each parent incubates that egg in a shift. We call them incubation shifts, which lasts 4 days each. So one parent will come, sit on the egg for 4 days. The other parent is out at sea foraging for food. And then the at sea parent comes back and switches and then sits there for 4 days while the other parent goes out and gets something to eat. Interestingly, these birds feed, once the chick hatches, they feed their fledglings stomach oil. So what they do is they go out to sea, they forage, and within their own digestive system, they kind of distill the fish and the copepods that they're eating into this highly energetic oil. It's 9,600 calories per gram. So I did a quick check just for a reference for you. The 2 other foods, including salmon, Atlantic salmon, and avocado, have the energetic content of about 2 calories per gram. I'm not suggesting that Leach's Storm-Petrel eat avocado. I'm just giving you that as a reference to say that stomach oil is a really highly energetic, highly rich food source for these chicks. So I think that's pretty neat. The single chick eats this energetic food and grows very large, fledges fully grown at 65 days. So it spends 65 days, which is upwards of 3 months and a bit, growing in the burrow underground. It never sees the sunlight until it emerges from its burrow and fledges to sea. The other interesting thing about Leach's Storm-Petrel and other members of the tube-nose family is that they've been studied for a very long time. In our region, they've been studied since the 1950s on Kent Island. That's one of the world's longest running studies on a single colony and on a single species. Kent Island is in the Bay of Fundy here in the Atlantic region. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the major colonies in Atlantic Canada. So this is a map showing areas where there are known colonies of Leach's Storm-Petrel in Atlantic Canada. They also exist, as I said, in the other areas of the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. But the estimated North Atlantic population is 5.8 million birds. If you zoom in a little closer and look at what's more specifically in our Atlantic region, we have here circled the colony at Baccalieu Island, which is the world's largest colony, which means that 90% of the North Atlantic's population of Leach's Storm-Petrel actually breeds in Eastern Canada. And of that percentage, 85% are in Newfoundland. So Newfoundland is a really important stronghold for this species. What do we know about the populations of Leach's Storm-Petrel? So across their range, there have been population declines at multiple colonies, not just a single one, but many of them across the range. At Baccalieu Island, this is the world's largest colony, there has been a documented loss of about 3.3 million petrels between 1989 and 2015. That's between two surveys that was done on that island. And similarly, a colony in Witless Bay, which is just next door, has seen a 55% population decline between two subsequent survey years, about 20 years apart. So as a result of these two major declines and others documented across the region, the species was listed on the IUCN Red List. That's International Union for the Conservation of Nature. It was listed as vulnerable in 2016. And then the other thing that ranks vulnerability of species in Canada is COSEWIC, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. They ranked it as threatened in 2020. And it's gone on to be listed as a threatened species in Canada because of this dramatic decline in populations. So, and that this decline has happened in a relatively recent period of time over the last 30 years. So why? What is going on to cause this decline? So for Leach's Storm-Petrel, there's probably multiple reasons. There's not a single smoking gun. There are many things that are happening very likely with this population, including changes in contaminants and pollutants in the ocean. Mercury accumulates in the aquatic system, and Leach's Storm-Petrel, along with other tube noses, are known to accumulate mercury in their system. There's likely climate-associated changes and shifts in their marine food web. They are vulnerable to predation from avian predators like gulls and owls at colonies and elsewhere. They are vulnerable to predation from mammals who might get onto colonies like mink or marten. Of course, rats or any other rodents are really damaging to these types of colonies. Interestingly, because they're nocturnal, they also have a vulnerability to being attracted to light at nighttime. So coastal lighting, night lighting, and lighting that occurs in association with offshore activities such as oil and gas production can cause a fatal attraction for Leach's Storm-Petrel. So with this species then, we have these alarming facts and this interesting question of what is happening with the population and can we do anything about it? So ultimately, as a group, it's great to come up with conservation objectives, the ultimate objective of which would be, let's stop the decline of Leach's Storm-Petrels. But before we get to that point, we actually need some intermediate steps, which are to find out more about the species, what's affecting them, where it's affecting them, and in fact, find out what we can do about it. So that's what I'll try to spend the rest of the time talking tonight about. Just as a review, for the species and to understand the declines in the population, there's a lot of knowledge gaps that researchers in the area have been trying to tackle. So we need to know better information on adult survival at all the colonies and year-round. We need to know about productivity. So that's how many chicks and how well do breeding birds do at colonies. How many chicks do they produce? We need to understand better about their vulnerability to island predators. What's happening with respect to mercury, microplastics, and other pollution in the ocean. What's happening with their diets and how that might be changing. Where they are at sea. So we call that spatial ecology. So what and why changes how they spend their time at sea. What are the risks they might encounter at sea, including light pollution or oiling or collisions with structures or predators. And then to update the information in terms of numbers of birds that we have at colonies and at new colonies. So the research group has been trying to look especially at some of these spatial questions using tracking devices to follow these birds around. And some of the questions related to spatial ecology include, do foraging birds overlap with offshore risks, such as oil and gas platforms? And what other risks might exist in their year-round spatial cycle? So again, what's Birds Canada's role in all of this? We're just a cog in the wheel. We helped to establish a petrel working group back in 2017, and that's continuing. So that working group just helps to build and strengthen existing partnerships among petrel researchers in Atlantic Canada, because there are many already. It helps to understand and monitor populations and risks and threats at key colonies. We've also been, as a group, collaborating to develop a species conservation strategy, which helps us map out what the risks are and what we might be able to do about it. And Birds Canada is also helping support fieldwork at particular colonies, because as you can imagine, if there are many colonies that need research done at them, there's sometimes not enough people to go around. So Birds Canada can help with the logistics and the fieldwork support in that case. So just another way of looking at this is we have kind of like a science piece of the puzzle, a management piece of the puzzle, and then a facilitation piece of the puzzle. So Environment Canada does a lot of management of colonies. They look at research, including tracking and demographic modeling. They're doing census work, and they do a lot of work on policy, regulation, and compliance with industry. That's Environment Canada's role. In terms of what the academic folks are working on, it's more, of course, more research focused, including light attraction at land and at sea, and some experimental studies on light attraction. They're looking at colony of origin studies in terms of trying to understand where birds you find away from colonies might be coming from. So for example, stranded birds or birds that have had some kind of mortality for some reason. And they're looking at carryover effects between winter and breeding periods and toxicology. And then, as I said, Birds Canada is just pulling all the pieces together to try and facilitate communication with the working group and provide logistic support and support for students and research projects with this whole group of people. Okay, now I'm going to take you just on a little, maybe a little trip here to see a little bit more about what it's like to research storm-petrels in Newfoundland. For a number of years, I've been lucky enough to accompany some colleagues to Baccalieu Island, which is off the Avalon Peninsula. This is what the slopes of Baccalieu looks like. Baccalieu is very famous in Newfoundland for its relationship to fishing and fishing communities. It's also an important bird area because of its importance to Leach's storm-petrel primarily. It's the world's largest colony. But in addition to storm-petrel, there are colonies here of northern gannets, Atlantic puffin, kittiwakes, and razorbills. So it's a very busy place to visit in the summer. To get there, you need to go to Baie Verte in Newfoundland. And we have a wonderful fisherman who lives in Baie Verte who has been fishing in the area and who has ties to Baccalieu Island going back to his grandparents' time. And he's a wealth of knowledge about petrels and about the marine system in the area, and he kindly takes us, a group of us every summer, out to visit Baccalieu Island from Bay de Vere. And this is the kind of support that we often have in Newfoundland, is getting folks to help access colonies and folks who are very knowledgeable about the marine system. So when you get to Baccalieu, you come into this not very good landing spot and bring your boat and your gear ashore and set up camp. There's nothing on Baccalieu other than birds. So when you go there to study the birds, you need to bring all your own stuff. And we live in tents for a period of time out there while researching, and of course, bring all our own gear and water and food, and then take it all off again when we leave. Baccalieu it's very interesting for storm-petrels because it has these gentle slopes at the top where the storm-petrels live, including this shrubby, tall fern, tuckamore forest with sort of a mixture of brambles and fern and forest. That's good for the petrels up at the top. And then along all the sides of the colony where it's more steep and it's cliffy, that's where the other birds tend to nest. The kittiwakes and murres and razorbills are there. And so when we're on Baccalieu, we spend our time at the top, and we have a couple of research plots that we study the petrels from. So I'm going to try to show you this sound of what it sounds like on Baccalieu Island at nighttime. I'm hoping you can hear this. So it's a loud place. When the birds are attending the colony, it's, millions of pairs of petrels calling to each other at night in the dark. And it's really quite a special experience to be out there. So on the islands, we have these plots. You can see in this left-hand picture, there's a little white string that goes around our study plot that marks out a series of burrows. I think there's about 400 burrows in that small rectangle. And those burrows are visited every year by petrels, but also by researchers who go stick your hand in the burrow and see who is in there. Each bird is marked individually with a little bracelet, like a band with a unique identification number. And so we can record which adults are returning each year and how many years that happens. So that's a really important part of the long-term monitoring on the Storm-Petrel colony. So this is a bit what it looks like when you're in the weeds grubbing burrows. And by grubbing, that's a funny word, but it's used for a descriptive word for what happens when you stick your arm in a burrow to get a bird out of it. It's called grubbing. So here's what that looks like.
Here we are at burrow 161. There it is. And the burrow is right here. Tiny little petrel burrow. I'm going to put my hand in there and see who I can find. Here's who I found. This little guy. I already got a band on him. So I'm going to have a look and see who it is. Weighing him. He weighs 67 grams. 67 grams. Wowie. It's all done. It's bird number. Let's see if we can read the number. Bird number 07009. And I'm going to put her back now. Bye. There she goes. Into the hole.
So ultimately, that kind of research where you're doing adult productivity and looking in burrows is not super complicated. It's finding birds, weighing them to understand how heavy they are, which gives us an indication of their condition, their body condition, identifying who it is and putting them back. So with that information, you can, it's simple on the outset to collect, but then you can do quite a lot with that information. Okay, so that's the long-term monitoring, which includes that survival monitoring. So again, finding those adults year after year. That's what's called a capture, mark, recapture study. So you capture the bird, you mark it with a band, you recapture it again over and over. We also look at fledging success. So how many chicks from the islands are leaving the nest and going out to sea. That's called fledge success. So the research group is looking at those parameters at 6 colonies in the region, including Baccalieu Island, but also Witless Bay in Newfoundland, also Kent Island in New Brunswick in the Bay of Fundy, Bon Portage and the Country Islands, which are in Nova Scotia, and a couple of others around the region. To do this kind of study, you need more than 10 years of data in order to get some of those birds over and over again and start getting a good picture of what's happening. That's been happening for a long time, especially with researchers at Environment Canada in Newfoundland. And they've found that the productivity, so breeding success, how many chicks, is quite high across the region. It's more than 80%. So there's lots of chicks being produced at colonies. However, long-lived species like the Leach's Storm-Petrel are expected to have very high adult annual survival, more than 90%. So that means more than 90% of those adults should be returning every year. But what has been found is that adult survival is actually quite low. Now, here the estimate we have is 78%. Now, compared to 90%, that doesn't seem like much, but it does have a very big impact on the population. So I'm going to try to explain a little bit about why that is by talking about a demographic model. So what the heck is a population or a demographic model? I just want to talk about that a little bit. So a population model, also called a demographic model, has 4 main components. One is adult survival. How much does how many adults survive from one year to the next? What's the reproductive success? In human populations, that would be what's the birth rate? How many chicks are produced and how many survive to fledging? There's also a measurement of recruitment. So that is actually how many birds, how many new young birds recruit into the breeding population. So survive and become breeders themselves. And then the 4th measurement of a population model is the death rate. So that's very similar across all kinds of all kinds of animal systems, is understanding demographics. So let's look at this a little bit. Let's say we have an adult, a single adult that's in the population, and we count him in subsequent years A, B, C, and D. We keep seeing the same adult. That's a measurement of adult annual survival. We also measure the reproductive success of each of these adults. So how many chicks are they producing, and does that chick survive across the number of years? And we look at, we would like to look at the juvenile survival and recruitment. Just a reminder that I haven't said this before, I don't think, but the juveniles actually have a very delayed maturity, and it takes a long time for them to recruit into the breeding population. 5 or more years that they're just out at sea, hanging out until they come back to the colony to start to breed. So what happens if in your population model you have chick mortality? So in 1 year, in year A, for some reason, maybe there was a heavy rain, maybe it was really cold, the chicks didn't survive. So you lose that opportunity to breed in a particular year. Maybe it's year A and year C, but it doesn't have a huge impact because the adults are still there to keep reproducing year after year. And in theory, an adult only has to replace itself once or twice for each adult in order for the population to survive. So what else could happen? This stage in which juveniles are recruited into the population, that's a place where there could be a mortality. And in fact, we don't know very much about that stage. Even if all those things keep happening, juvenile mortality is high and chick mortality is high. If adult survival is high, then you still have a chance to perpetuate the population. If adult mortality occurs, if the adults die, then those chances are gone. And so I don't know if that helps explain it, but that's why adult survival is so important to long-lived species, especially species which only produce one chick per year. So again, long-lived species should have a high annual survival, but in Leach's Storm-Petrel in the Atlantic region, it seems that they don't. It's low, so it has presumably quite a big impact. We don't know why it's low, which is what we're trying to figure out. Could it be predation? Could it be risks at sea in the marine system? Could it be something to do with their food? Could it be contaminants? Could it be all of the above? We don't know. And the other point I want to make is that we know almost nothing about juvenile recruitment in this system, because once those little juveniles fledge and go out to sea, it's a complete empty. You can't track them, you can't follow them, you don't know what happens to them. So that's a really big knowledge gap in this system. So to try to understand what's happening at sea for these birds, this research group has spent a lot of time trying to understand their spatial ecology using tracking devices to answer the question, where do these birds go at sea and what might they encounter there? So this research includes year-round deployments of a small tracking device. You can see it on the right-hand side. There's these little black cylinders with a tracking device, a geolocator attached. They're very small and they go on the leg of the petrel, and the petrel carries that throughout. You put it on at the colony, it carries it for the whole winter, it goes where it needs to go, and then it comes back. And when it comes back the next year, you cross your fingers and try to get it back by going to the burrow where you know that bird was and looking for it again the next year. So that's year-round tracking with geolocators. The research group also looks at putting GPS on these birds. So GPS have only recently got small enough in the last probably 8 years to actually attach to a Storm-Petrel. This is what a GPS looks like. It's on the left-hand side, and there's a little small one there with a nickel for scale. So they're very tiny. They are archival, which means they store the data. They don't send the data to a satellite. You still have to get this device back. That helps us understand to a quite fine resolution where the birds are foraging around the breeding colony each season. And this work so far has been done at 7 different colonies across the region to start getting a comparison of where these birds are at the different colonies during the breeding season and year round. Let's look at a scribbly map to see what this looks like. So these are results from tracking multiple birds at multiple colonies. So let's look at this map a little bit. So each colony is indicated with a yellow star. This is Bacalhau up here. And each colony, a group of birds, is indicated by the same color of squiggly lines. So the birds at Bacalhau are tracked, and that's noted by these red squiggly lines. And down here, the birds at Kent Island and the Bay of Fundy are represented by the gray squiggly lines. And so you can see there's different distributions during the breeding season. So this is from approximately June, July to August. For these different colonies, they're occupying different space at sea during the summer. And so if you have any spatially discrete risks, like if you have something that's happening within the home range of these birds during their breeding season, that will potentially affect the different colonies differently if those birds are impacted by that risk. So an example of that is these little X's here show where there are offshore oil and gas production platforms off the Grand Banks. And birds at Gull Island here in the yellow seem to overlap that area more than birds at Baccalieu Island, for example. So do we see that in any changes in mortality or other impacts at different colonies? We're not sure, but that's the kind of thing that tracking helps you understand a bit better. Okay, this is a very different kind of data. This is data from geolocators, which are a bit more messy. The data is messy because it's affected by light levels and changes in light during the equinox. That's a bit technical, but what I want you to take away from this is not that there are a bunch of birds over land, but that birds occupy a very wide amount of space. This is raw data from their winter distribution. So we have birds tagged with geolocators in this example, 3 different colonies at Bon Portage, Country Island, and Kent Island. And this work is in progress, and it's a very raw, unfiltered data. So there are mathematical ways to make this look more accurate, which we haven't done yet. But this is what it looks like when you see the birds congregating in the Atlantic region. And then as they move throughout their year, they move through the Atlantic Ocean, they congregate in Africa, some of them all the way down to southern Africa, Southwest Africa, some of them off the coast of Brazil. And so this represents their year-round movements. So this potentially has implications for these birds to be encountering more widespread marine risks throughout the Atlantic. And what would that look like is the next question that we would like to find out. Another group of researchers are looking at contaminants in storm petrels. As I said before, storm petrels accumulate mercury. So this graph is showing the levels of mercury in the blood from different colonies. The colonies are noted down along the x-axis here. And the colonies are grouped in this graph are grouped from colonies with high blood mercury to colonies with lower blood mercury. And what was noticed was that the colonies where the blood samples were taken from Newfoundland tended to have higher mercury than the colonies in the Bay of Fundy and the Gulf of Maine. So what is that about? They looked into that a little bit more, and they tried to connect tracking information with blood levels of mercury. Here's that scribbly plot again. So when you plot the tracks of petrels against the mercury levels that they have circulating in their blood, what is found is that the mercury in the blood corresponds to the depth of water that birds are foraging at. So birds foraging in deeper water, such as off the Grand Banks and off of Newfoundland over here, tend to have higher blood mercury levels, and birds that are foraging in shallower water, more in the Bay of Fundy, tend to have lower mercury levels. So there seems to be a connection there with the body of water, the habit of where you're foraging, and what kind of mercury loads the body is accumulating. Another risk for Leach's storm petrel that we know a lot about and that has been studied a lot is light pollution. So this is just a map of what kind of light pollution is happening along the eastern seaboard in Atlantic Canada at nighttime. And many of you probably know that light attracts storm petrels. There's a great program in Witless Bay looking at stranded petrels who come ashore because they're attracted to light at night during the breeding season, because their colonies are so close to these coastal communities where there might be light. A shout out to another partner here that works for Storm-Petrels. No, the CPAWS, Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, Newfoundland and Labrador chapter, have a beautiful program out of Witless Bay, collecting stranded storm-petrels and puffins as well, and taking care of them overnight and releasing them. The risk here is that when birds get stranded, they become vulnerable to things on land, like predation from cats, getting hit by cars, or hitting structures at night when they're disoriented. So this is a really neat program that does community-driven initiatives to reduce light in communities and mitigate light. They document the strandings, and they do a rescue and release. And so it's really interesting. They have a great success with this. And I'm interested in knowing if there are other areas in Newfoundland or in other areas of Atlantic Canada where light is an issue for storm-petrels and what can be done about it. So that's a really neat community program that can help a lot. One thing I'm really happy about is the working group has been able to kind of drum up enough support and enough research interest that we've been able to support multiple student projects, master's, honors, and postdoc and PhD students working on all kinds of things, which has been really interesting. It kind of it's like an engine in the research system. So we have folks over the last number of years studying predation, studying census, so numbers of birds, redoing census at colonies, looking at acoustic monitoring, diet composition, microplastics and marine pollutants, looking at behavior, risk behavior. I think you might actually be having a talk later on in this series from Sydney Collins, looking at risk behavior. Population monitoring and tracking in Newfoundland, more of that, and also contaminant work and spatial ecology. And there are others kind of coming down the pipe. So that's been very productive for this working group, and it's been a pleasure to be able to help kind of keep that rolling. The other thing the working group has been doing is, as I mentioned before, conservation planning. So it's sort of a academic exercise, but the idea is that you start over here on the right, you start with your conservation target, which is, let's save the petrels. You list the threats over here on the left with whatever they might be. Maybe in this case, it's lighting or flaring from offshore oil and gas. And you try to put things in place that mitigate the effects of the threat on your conservation target. So what does that look like? If your goal is to stop the decline of petrels and you have all these risks that are potentially impacting them, how do you investigate each one of those and try to understand how to stop it from impacting your target? So here's just an example. You might develop a mitigation strategy. That's just a fancy way of saying steps toward a goal. So within the working group, we've been working on this. So what if light attraction is one of the risks you really want to dig into? Well, we know we need more research to understand that better, and that's been happening at Memorial University and Acadia and with Environment Canada. You might identify mitigation measures like temporal restrictions on flaring, like changes in light coloration where light is used at night, and other things that relate to beneficial management practices for light itself. You might work on a communication strategy to industry, to ports, to municipalities, to communities. You might try to get a commitment from some of those groups to alter or change their practices of night lighting. And then you're going to always want to try to understand barriers and feedback, and getting feedback to how your work is that how what you're doing is actually working. So you need studies to look at that, and you need observers, you need people to notice it. So this is something that the group has been working on to try to plan out better. What are the different steps that we might be able to take to help Leach's Storm-Petrel? And then the idea is that you would measure it by seeing a reduction in what's happening to a threat reduction. So in this case, you might see reduced stranding of petrels in coastal communities, and that would be a measurement that you are being successful with your light mitigation. So from now going forward, the Petrel Working Group is still struggling with all of this work. We aim to complete the species conservation plan and outline actions that can be done. We'll continue to facilitate field work and student research projects. All of the research that's happened so far, including those student projects, could make a very good academic symposium where we collect all the information on storm petrels and present it kind of in a big workshop to try to drum up support for research and for understanding the species. And then the working group will just continue their ongoing research on tracking, on population modeling to better understand sources of mortality, looking at stewardship with industry and anything that relates to offshore marine risks, trying to mitigate light pollution, and trying to understand more about where stranded or dead birds are coming from so that we can understand if there are particular colonies that are more at risk of this kind of influence. So that was a lot of information. I feel very lucky to be able to participate in this kind of work and to know that all the people here listed on this slide, all these people are working very passionately towards conservation of Leach's storm petrel. So these people make up the working group, and there are probably more people out there doing a lot of good work for storm petrel. So I want to thank them and thank the people who have supported this work. And so I'm very happy to take questions if you have them. And thank you all very much for coming.
Thanks, Laura. That was fantastic. Great talk. And there are a few questions in the chat. So I don't know, do you want me to read them to you if you can't see them?
Sure, that will be fine.
All right. So Sherry wanted to know whether any of the tagged petrels have been found on land, or is it mainly fledglings that get stranded?
So there's kind of two questions in there. The tagged petrels, the ones, I'm not sure if she means tagged with a tracking device or tagged with more like a identification, like a unique bracelet. So either way, those tagged petrels are not usually found on land stranded. We just find them back at the colony on our annual monitoring. But strandings occur with juveniles and with adults in the it's usually in the fall of the year, but sometimes at other weird times of year. I have heard that with the Hurricane Fiona that just passed through, that there have been a lot of strandings of petrels. So I think the question was, is it just juveniles? It's a lot of juveniles, but it's also both adults and juveniles that get stranded.
Okay, Sherry, hopefully that answers your question. Feel free to unmute if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah.
Okay, and Roger wanted to know, how frequently do birds change nesting locations year on year?
Great question. I don't have a number, but typically they only change if something happens during the breeding season to make them lose their chick. So if they lose a mate, if they lose their chick for some reason, like it gets eaten by a gull, or if their burrow collapses, then they'll move. But they don't move very far. They might move just a few meters in either direction of their existing burrow. So it's a low percentage of birds that switch their burrows.
Which is great because it means you get your geolocators back, right?
That's right. You do get them back.
Very useful. I should also add that Roger mentioned that you refer to them as storm petrels, but there are different species of storm petrels.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Everything that I've talked about tonight is the Leach's storm petrel. Thank you. For brevity, I have been saying storm petrel, but yeah, there's lots of other species of storm petrel. This is the one that this working group happens to be focused on at the moment.
Excellent. And for the purposes of the breeding bird atlas, it's also the one that we're interested in because it's the only one that breeds in Newfoundland.
Mm-hmm.
Janine wants to know if the levels of mercury recorded are sufficient to cause any harm, and what evidence is there that harm is caused by mercury, if there is any evidence?
Another excellent question. So that is something that, again, we don't know. What we would call the effects that we see, if there are any, would be sublethal. So the effects are not very evident. We don't know if there are effects on breeding success, effects on cognition, effects on development of the chicks or navigation in adults or in juveniles. We know almost nothing about the actual biological effects of mercury. We just know that mercury is really high in storm-petrels, and it can be really high in other prosolariforms as well. So either they're very susceptible to mercury poisoning, or they are resistant to it and are able to accumulate those high loads without any really obvious effects, or both. So I'm sorry, that's not a better answer, but it is something that this group has been grappling with. Just because they have high mercury levels, does that mean anything? Does that mean some populations are more likely to suffer effects if they have less of, more of it? We don't know. Sorry.
It's a good answer. I mean, just means you need more research, right? Petrel Working Group needs to keep conducting research. Robert said that he found a couple of dead petrels on the West Coast following Hurricane Fiona. He didn't notice any tags, but he wondered if this is the sort of thing that should be reported or recorded, and who that would go to. Yeah,
that's a good question. I guess, yes, it is something that's common after storms like that. And I've had reports of that as well. There's not a good coordinated way to report strandings, especially if it's just for a small number of birds, but like up to 10 or something. That's if it was a really large stranding event, hundreds, that would go to the Canadian Wildlife Service in Newfoundland, and I would report that to Sabina Wilhelm, who she's a seabird biologist and manager of colony research in Newfoundland, and she would want to know about mass stranding events. But it's a good question. I don't think we have a good system of reporting individual sightings of stranded birds.
Laura, is there any evidence, this is actually my question, but with avian flu decimating so many of our seabird colonies, is there any evidence of avian influenza being an issue with petrels?
I don't think we know yet. I do know that this working group did some sampling of petrels at colonies and sent those samples away to the lab to see if they had any avian influenza. And I don't, as far as I know, I haven't checked for about a month, but as far as I know, those samples didn't come back positive. So we're unsure if they've been affected by avian influenza so far. That could, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. They are also quite different from some of those colonial species that spend a lot of time close to each other. Like gulls and murres, which are all, and gannets, all crammed in, presumably breathing on each other and spreading disease around. It could be that because of the way that they attend colonies, they're all individually in burrows. It could be that the disease doesn't spread exactly the same way, but we don't know.
I see. So petrels are good at the social distancing then.
They are. Those burrows are they're definitely 2 petrel lengths apart, if not meters apart. Yes.
Excellent. I jumped the queue with my questions, so I should go back to the questions in the chat. Erica wondered if there were any other types of toxicological studies conducted.
Good question. In terms of other contaminants in circulating in tissues, I don't think so, not currently. There may be some work on other contaminants like PCBs and other heavy metals in other regions, but I don't think we know a lot here. The other thing that's slightly related is studies of microplastics and plastics accumulated in the stomach. I know that's not exactly toxicology, but it is known that these birds, they surface feed, and so they pick up things off the surface of the water, including microplastics. So a very large proportion of chicks and adults do have microplastics in their digestive system.
Okay, and we have just a couple more questions here, Laura. So Pat wondered whether Leach's storm-petrels depend on larger marine creatures like whales or dolphins to drive prey to the surface.
I don't know that, but I do know that I suspect not as much, not like some of the larger seabirds that forage in the daytime, such as shearwaters or gannets, and they have this relationship with humpback whales. I know that tend to drive fish to the surface when they're blowing their bubble nets to drive fish up. But because Leach's storm-petrel are nocturnal, and they forage nocturnally, I suspect that relationship is not as strong. What does happen is these birds forage way offshore on these fish called myctophids. Myctophids are glow-in-the-dark fish, and so it totally makes sense when you think about nocturnal species. They're attracted to light. They probably navigate using moon and stars, and they're attracted to glow-in-the-dark fish in their natural ecology. So of course they would also be attracted by artificial light. So these fish are really interesting. They live in the mid-level of the ocean, and they have a nocturnal migration upwards to the surface of the water. So they have what we call a diurnal migration. They go down in the day and they come up to the surface at night. And so that's what storm-petrels are eating. And so I think their foraging is driven more by this diurnal cycle of their prey than by other marine creatures.
Makes sense. Okay, we have two final questions from Janine. So first, she notes that in the North Pacific, at Buldeer Island and elsewhere in Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, a substantial proportion of breeders nest in grass or dense vegetation, not in burrows. And so she wondered what proportion of Atlantic Canadian breeders are non-burrow users.
I've never seen that. Now I don't know all the things about petrels, but I'm going to say that none of them nest in dense grass or vegetation. I think they are always in burrows. Now, if anyone else on the call is part of the working group or knows differently, please correct me, but I think they're all burrow nesters.
Fair enough. And Janine's second question was saying that by recapturing the birds in the burrows, you're measuring local survival as opposed to adult survival per se. And so is there any possibility that your low rates of adult survival are an artifact of the methodology? So the birds are being disturbed and are moving and not being recaptured, and that's why you're getting low adult survival rates.
Possibly. But I think, so there's multiple thoughts in my head here. So yeah, that's a really important question. So I think that folks who are smarter than me, who are doing those fancy demographic models, would be able to tease that apart to a certain extent. So there's another research project that I didn't tell you about out of Environment Canada. It's a colleague, Dave Fifield, is working on looking at within season burrow occupancy and within season survival. So exactly what you said, how often are those adults returning to their burrows within a season? as opposed to from one season to the next. And he's doing this with pit tags. So these little things that record the bird going in and out of burrows throughout the season. So he's looking at local survival and how that might change or differ from that year-round survival estimate. And I guess the other thing I would wonder about is if local survival is more important at particular colonies. Like, are there some colonies that are studied more intensely than others? Would you see any particular effects of those highly studied colonies versus, and indicative potentially of birds moving around more? I think you can get a measurement of how much birds move around from one year to the next, because you do find them sometimes in the wrong burrow. So if that was occurring at one colony more than another, you might pick that up. And that's not really happening at the studies where these birds are at the colonies where the birds are studied. So great question. I think there are people trying to tease that apart. And I think that will fit into the demographic model that folks are trying to put together.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. And I think we've run out of questions in the chat, and I think we've probably kept you on the hot seat for long enough there. So I will just say again, thank you very much for the talk. And there's lots of thanks in the chat as well. People are saying that it was an excellent talk. So we really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks very much, everyone. It's really, I'm sorry I can't see you all and chat with you all and have a cup of tea after this, but maybe someday that will be possible. Anyway, thanks so much for attending and learning about petrels and sharing your stories there in the chat.
Definitely. And we'll be back again next week with another webinar. So come out and join us next week.
Okay.
Have a good night, everyone.